Meno responds to Socrates' persistent questioning about what is virtue by saying that virtue is the desire for beautiful things and the ability to attain them. Upon hearing this definition, Socrates applies questioning in order to begin the process of sorting out what is truthful and able to be taken up from what is not, and what must be whittled away or left behind. He begins by asking about the first component of Meno's contention concerning virtue, namely, that virtue has to do with desiring beautiful things, and if beautiful things, then good things. Doesn't everyone desire good? Meno thinks not. Some folks do, but many people desire evil things. After all, look at all the horrible things people do to one another. But then, Socrates inquires, do they desire these things knowing them to be evils? Or do they rather desire what is evil only because they falsely suppose that such a thing would be really good? That is, something worth having or doing. After giving it some thought, Meno comes around to realizing that, in fact, when we desire evils, we're only doing so due to our ignorance about the fact that such things are not really good for us. Hence, our understanding of things affects the way that we value them, and it shapes what we seek after. Think of your own students here. How much do you think they'll seek after certain goods, supposing them to be better or higher goods than they really are? Or conversely, how often do they seek after bad things, supposing them to be good? How often do you do this? Can you help your students to see and to evaluate things around them more accurately? Through philosophizing, can you administer to their deep ignorance in this regard? Can you administer to your own? Following the dialogue, we see that virtue really doesn't have much to do with wishing for good things, since everybody naturally does that anyway. Even folks who aren't virtuous, i.e. folks who do bad things or want evil things, supposing them to be good. So we can slice that bit of Meno's definition off as extraneous. What then of the second part? Virtue as the ability to attain good things. Socrates approaches this portion of Meno's definition as an opportunity to have him question the value of all these diverse goods that attract him. Things like health and wealth, fame and glory, honor and offices. What if such goods are attained by unjust or impious means? Is that virtue? Meno thinks not. So, says Socrates, in order for the attainment of such goods to be virtuous, their acquisition must transpire with some part of virtue, like justice or temperance or holiness, right? Similarly, what about not attaining goods when that is best? Aren't there times when it's not virtuous? When it's virtuous not to attain such things for oneself? Meno thinks so. So, Socrates says, the ability to attain certain mitigated goods is not really any better necessarily than the ability not to attain them. And Meno comes to see Socrates' point here. And just at this point, when they've come around to tearing down both halves of Meno's definition of virtue, Socrates pokes fun at Meno once again for making many out of one, just like before. They're looking for the nature of virtue, but all they keep ending up with is a grocery list of specific kinds of virtues, like justice, courage, temperance, and so forth. Coming to know what exactly virtue is harder than Meno thought. Meno's getting a bit frustrated here. He's been asked by Socrates to tell him what he and Gorgias say is virtue, but every time they investigate the Gorgian claims, they just fall like turds to the ground. At this point, Meno vents his exasperation with dialectic, saying, Socrates, I've heard about how you always seem to be wandering around Athens all perplexed, and that when others speak with you, they end up being perplexed as well. You're just like a stingray that numbs everything it touches, and now I totally know what everyone says about you is true. Here I am trying to answer you, and every time I do, you just numb me, bro. And it's very strange, because I've spoken with lots of people in the past about virtue, and it's always gone really well. But with you, zap, I'm numb. Socrates seems to enjoy the comparison of himself with an old, ugly stingray. Most times, anyone who compares Socrates to anything is sure to pick an ugly animal, by the way. Socrates compliments Meno for being so handsome. But he also says that the comparison is unfair unless Meno understands that as a stingray, Socrates isn't just numbing others, but that he's numbing himself too. This is important, because often when people accuse Socrates of being sly or a sophist, that famous Socratic irony everyone talks about, they really mean he's just faking being ignorant or perplexed, and that really he does know. Socrates wants to say here that he actually doesn't. He's numb, because he knows he's where he doesn't know. And whereas Meno used to think he himself knew what virtue was, now he too is aware that his own suppositions about knowing these were actually unfounded. Now he too knows that he didn't know what he thought he knew. He's numb, just like Socrates. But this isn't a bad thing, this is a good thing. Because you won't ever start to seek to know anything, and you won't ever try to learn anything if you already suppose you know everything. Those of you who one day go on to teach high school students will experience this firsthand. How hard it is to make an impression upon teenagers. One of the most common things my daughter used to say when she hit her teen years was, "Yeah, Dad, I know." Teenagers know everything. My aunt used to have a sign up in her house that said, "Teenagers, leave home while you still know everything." At a certain age, and maybe thereafter for the rest of your life, if one's not careful, we can become very closed off to learning. We can become full of pride and pretense to knowledge. And many of us dread not knowing, or the experience of having our ignorance or pretense to knowledge exposed. In fact, school ingrains this dread and anxiety in students mostly by always demanding from them answers, but rarely, if ever, questions. Students are commanded to demonstrate what they know, but never to expose what they do not know. School is actually very unsocratic and anti-inquiry in this regard. It regularly smothers the philosophic spirit of children, to such an extent that, rather than being filled with wonder in their puzzlement, they actually respond with anger at you, the teacher, who by your dialectical questioning has brought them to this state. And not just the teenagers, their parents too. It wasn't the kids, after all, who killed Socrates. It was their parents, and the authorities and movers and shakers of Athens who had their ignorance exposed in public, and who felt the sting of their own hurt pride and humiliation. They certainly wanted to get that Socrates for what he'd done to them, and for how he'd made them look in front of their kids, and for teaching their kids to disrespect them. And if you do this as a teacher, you're next. Philosophy and dialectic are dangerous, ladies and gentlemen. But we mustn't shirk our deep commitment to pursuing the most excellent of goods, wisdom. We must cultivate courage as teachers if we are to emulate Socrates. And if ever we are to inquire we must first of all be willing to have our ignorance exposed. Willing and even thankful for this exposure. Let us all show gratitude for learning that what we thought we knew, we didn't know. And that's the first step towards knowing. That provides us the impetus for inquiry. Thank you, Stingray. At this point in the dialogue, Meno gets up to his Gorgias tricksiness again. He asks Socrates cleverly, "And how will you inquire into a thing when you are wholly ignorant of it? How could you ever know to inquire about it if you don't know about its existence in the first place, eh? But then, if you already knew about it, then why would you ever inquire about it? Because you already know about it, eh? Gotcha, Socrates! Ooh, snap!" Socrates sees how Meno's aristical spirit has not left him, and that it is once again shutting down any further possibility for inquiry here. He sees that he must take a new approach to dealing with Meno's resistance to inquiry. But how to proceed? Sometimes the easiest and best way to open up students to inquiry and to wondering is to provide them with tales of wonder, with fabulous stories, or with myths. Indeed, Aristotle says that lovers of myths and philosophers, or lovers of wisdom, both share much in common, since both are filled with wonder at the things around them, and wonder is the beginning of philosophy. And the point here is to try and get Meno open to philosophizing, to seeking to know what is, and what is virtue in particular. And Socrates is no enemy of the poets and musicians, contrary to what you've been told. Witness here the use he now makes of the great words of the ancient poets and of the deep traditions. Socrates hearkens Meno back to the words of Pindar, one of the most famous Greek poets, who tells a story about the immortality of the soul. This tale is an excellent example of how human beings use fiction to relay deep truths. How many beautiful stories have you read? And how many wonderful movies have you seen that are very much fiction, but that nonetheless speak deep and precious truths to you? This is the power of poetry and story and myth. It communicates truths to us that we might not be open to or able to access in other ways. Meno has proven resistant to dialectical investigations aimed at inquiry into being, so let's hear from the poets instead, and from the priestesses who tell us of such things and give us an image that might serve as a metaphor to enlighten our understanding. Let's evoke a grand picture or narrative about being in order to inform our sight and to enable us to see what otherwise we might not be able to open or be open to seeing, rather. The myth of recollection or anamnesis that Socrates recounts builds upon ancient traditions about the transmigration of souls after death. How when we die, our bodies and our mortal nature die away, but something of the human being resides. Something of anything or anyone possessed of soul does not die. Instead, this immortal aspect ventures to Hades, where after a period it rises back to the world of the living in some different form. And the cycles of life repeat and go round and round like this interminably. And so the story goes, because we've always been around in some form or another, it's never really the case that we're truly ignorant about things. We've seen it all before, after all, because we've already been there and done that. We've always been a part of everything else in this grand cosmic whole, and everything else has always been, in some deep sense, also and always part of us. We're part of the cosmos, like a beautiful little and fleeting configuration of its disparate and mixed parts. But we're also like a little version of the entire cosmos, because in ourselves we possess and are everything else as a kind of microcosm. When we're born into the world as human beings, we're so very lucky, because now we have a chance to remember everything and anything of what we've already seen or already known, in some sense simply by virtue of how our own being fully participates in the entire spectrum of being. We participate in all levels of being. Aristotle can shed some light on this for us if we look at what he says about the soul. What is soul? Not necessarily anything spooky. The word soul simply implies a principle of self-movement. A boy kicking a ball is a self-mover, possessed of soul. But the ball being kicked? Not so much. It's moved from outside, right? In Latin, the words for soul are anima and animus. We get our words animal, animated, animation, all from the Latin for things that move themselves. But in Aristotle, there are all different kinds of soul or principles of self-movement. Different things and critters move in different ways. At the most basic level, and maybe in a way that some folks would dispute, there's such a thing as mineral soul. That is, the stars and planets have a kind of principle of self-movement, right? They track across the heavens, and the Greeks plotted their course and knew them as grand travelers. And then volcanoes erupt and earthquakes tremble. So the earth sure does move when it wants to. But even beyond these sorts of movements, there's also the more basic way that all things that are active by virtue of their existence. They simply be. But being is an activity. If you look back at the first chapter of Genesis, for instance, and you read there how God says, be, and suddenly stuff was. Well, that's because by virtue of our very existence, we're acting in accordance with a divine decree. We're acting. So, simple being is a kind of activity. The Greeks just chose to name it, and they called it mineral soul. So next time you take attendance in your class, you too are taking into consideration your students' mineral soul. They're getting credit just for showing up. Like a rock, as Bob Seger sings. Of course, human beings participate in mineral soul, some of us more than others perhaps, but we also partake in what the Greeks called vegetable or nutritive soul. That's the kind of self-movement that describes growth. Think of a plant, how its roots reach down, seeking out water, and how its branches stretch upwards towards the sun and into the fresh air. See how a plant moves to grow? We do that too. Rocks don't. But anything that grows participates in this kind of soul. And then there's animal or appetitive soul. Critters have appetites. They get hungry, and they get thirsty. They have sexual drives. They experience fears and yearnings and want. They have a stomach. They're afflicted by needs that drive them, and they move in ways to fulfill these drives. That's the life of an animal, pretty much. And as human beings, we participate in that too. Rocks don't. Plants don't. But critters and us humans do. But as human beings, we're not just moved to fulfill the lower appetites of the animal soul. In fact, it's pretty important that we rise above our animal natures, like your ma told you when she said, "Quit behaving like an animal." We have a kind of higher, rational principle that distinguishes us from your average bear. We make rational movements. We're moved by our wondering and our questioning. We engage in this kind of activity that we call reasoning. Our minds reach out for truth and for understanding. We can seek to know what is in a manner that elevates us above the other beasties. Our minds engage in discursive thought. This is our rational soul, a peculiar principle of self-movement, to say the least. And quite marvelous, too, because we can know the world and ourselves not only by way of reasoning from point to point in a problem-solving kind of way, we also can know in a non-discursive fashion. We can gaze all in one look upon what is in contemplation, and we can seek to know in this fashion what is beyond all discursive thought and knowing. Human beings are really remarkably blessed and so lucky to be born into such a configuration that spans the entire spectrum of cosmic being, even able to reach out and to know the ground of our own being. So the quaint little tale that Pindar tells and that Socrates retells to Meno is endearing to me personally. The tale renders things for us in a childlike simplicity, all in one look. One doesn't need to be spooky to appreciate it. Socrates isn't asking us to believe any doctrine here. There's no dogma. It's a story. But like any good story, it reveals some deep, deep truths to us. What does it reveal? It reveals how we can come to know anything and everything that is simply by virtue of our own existence, and how the human being fully, completely participates in all realms of being. The medieval church called this our capax omnium, or the capacity of our minds to know everything that is, for everything that has being is. And what is true because it has being, because it is. And the mind participates in the knowledge of what is truth. And there is no aspect of what is that is not, in some sense, a part of ourselves. For we are a little cosmion of all that is. Indeed, when we come to know, we're only coming to know what we already are. And what we already are, we always have been. This is the basic idea behind the story of souls transmigrating and recollecting, or anamnesis. It is a story and a fiction, but it communicates a beautiful truth for us to consider. So what is inquiry? Fundamentally, inquiry is looking into oneself, looking into the world and the things that one sees in order to know their being. It is bringing to consciousness the manner of each thing's participation in being, through recognizing or recollecting how we ourselves are participants in that self-same cosmic order of being. Nobody who learns because their head is an empty space, or a blank slate upon which a teacher writes the truth, or into which knowledge is poured. Learning does not transpire according to Freier's banking model. Learning is anamnetic. It is recollective. It is all about cultivating greater sensitivity to what we already are, and to what everything already is. Learning is about coming to increased awareness of the manner of our being and the manner in which all things participate in being, and how we participate in being, how we are all part of all, everything is part of us. Aristotle says that this activity of inquiry is our true nature as human beings. All human beings desire to know. Inquiry is our deeply spiritual activity as human beings. When you promote inquiry in your classrooms as teachers, you will be doing a great service for your students. Inquiry is the key to all deep and foundational learning and understanding. It is what makes us human, and it speaks to our highest nature. Having been told the story about anamnesis, Meno's curiosity is piqued. He wants to have a more concretized demonstration of how anamnesis is, in fact, the manner in which we learn. This is where the discussion of geometry arises. Now, to save time here, I'm not going to go through all the ins and outs of the learning process as illustrated. We could certainly spend much productive time, learning about how to ask questions in math, and how to do inquiry-based learning with students using Socrates as our model. We could look at how Socrates demonstrates a teacher's skill with students by allowing them to explore and to test hypotheses, and then to develop problem-solving strategies, and the importance of visuals for learning and so forth. But we'll forego these things for now and perhaps discuss them another time. Instead, I'd simply draw your attention to how Socrates chooses a young slave boy for the demonstration, just to show you how it's possible for anyone to recall or to recollect quite complicated things, and to come to understand things that were never poured into one's head or written in one's head as a blank slate or deposited into one's head like a banking transaction. How essentially everything that the boy learns, he learns simply by recollecting. How Socrates never tells him what to think. How he never tells him the answer to anything, but only asks him questions. How the capax omnium of the mind is essentially demonstrated in this short display of mathematical or geometric inquiry. After their mathematical foray into anamnetic inquiry, Socrates again reminds Meno that he's not here spouting a doctrine or a dogma, or asking Meno to believe anything by telling him Pindar's tale. In fact, he says, there are other things about the argument that I would not confidently affirm. But he does stand by how helpful such a tale is in overcoming Meno's earlier heuristical argument that a person can never inquire. The tale about anamnesis gives us courage and perhaps delight for inquiry. And it invites us to see that the truth of things is always within us already, just as Socrates says. This is because truth is always truth about being, and our own human being participates in all that is. Hence, we need only look within ourselves to recall the truth that lies there waiting to be recollected or rediscovered. Once again, Socrates would have Meno redirect his thoughts towards the question, what is virtue? And once again, Meno resists. He still only wants to explore secondary considerations about whether virtue is taught, or whether it's present by nature. Questions that presume one already knows what virtue is, a knowledge that clearly neither Socrates nor Meno possess at this point. Socrates sees how the youthful Meno lacks self-control or self-rule. Meno wants what he wants, and that's all that he wants. He's unwilling to put aside his desire for immediate gratification of his wants, or to follow Socrates, who knows at least what order their inquiry must take for it to reap any benefits. How many times will this happen in your class and among your students, eh? Youthful students are not exactly good self-rulers. Very many of them lack self-restraint or any kind of filter on their mouths. They want what they want, and that's all that they want. How can you get them to put aside such things in order to redirect their attention toward the more fruitful things or the task at hand? Socrates' solution to this problem is once again to give way to Meno's persistence, with the qualification, however, knowing that it is a bit silly to suppose that whatever they happen to find about whether virtue is teachable or innate, before they even know what virtue is, Socrates doesn't want to puff Meno up with pretensions to false knowledge. So he says, sure, Meno, we can look into this question you have, but we need to recognize that whatever we find is only hypothetical. That is, we're assuming that virtue is this way or that way. And given that assumption, we're going to see what follows from it. So be aware that whatever turns up in our inquiries isn't the same thing as knowing for sure. The hypothesis they begin with is that if virtue is a kind of knowledge, then it must be teachable. And virtue, being that good by which we are rendered good, is a bit different than health or strength or beauty or wealth, or other goods we might possess, since having any of these, we might still be jerks or get up to rotten stuff. And the same goes not just for external goods, but also internal goods of the soul. We might be courageous, for example, but where there's courage without wisdom, or where our courage is kind of mindless, well, we're not really hitting the mark of virtue at all, are we? We're rather behaving rashly, boldly, or maybe recklessly, which can be pretty harmful. So, virtue, in order to exist, must have something to do with wisdom that knows the right ends and how to attain them in any case. The Greek word used here for wisdom is phronesis, which means practical wisdom, or the ability to get at the good end that is needed in any given situation by the correct or best means in a given situation. Given that phronesis is like this, you can see how valuable it is as a characteristic quality of a fine teacher. Always being able to find the right route to the good ends for your students, for yourself. What a wonderful quality this would be to possess. But can it be taught to us in, say, a BEd program? Or if not taught, is it something we have by nature? It's like they sometimes say about teachers, either you got it or you don't got it. Or is it something that comes to us, if it comes at all, through other means? Given that virtue is in some part to do with wisdom, then it seems clear to both Socrates and Meno that it isn't in some people simply by nature, since if it were, we'd be protecting such people since they were small children and raising them up very carefully so nobody might corrupt them, which means to suggest that that it's something that's taught to people. But then, if virtue is a kind of knowledge or something that can be taught, wouldn't there be teachers of it? Asked Socrates. Meno agrees. So let's look to see if we can find any examples of such teachers of virtue. Socrates has, in fact, spent much of his life looking for folks who can do this, but his efforts have always been unsuccessful. It's easy to find people who can teach carpentry, or shoemaking, or math, or science, or history, for example, but it's quite another thing to find folks who can teach virtue. Just at this time, along comes Anytus into the Lyceum, who sits next to them. Anytus is Meno's sponsor, or host, while he's visiting Athens. And as we've already learned, Anytus is one of the men responsible for Socrates' death only a few years later. Socrates knows all about Anytus, as would anyone know of his fame, or rather his infamy, as a failed general, and his notoriety for bribing juries in particular. In fact, modern scholars like Deborah Nails and Douglas McDowell, they point out that Anytus's method of bribery became such a great affront to justice in the minds of the Athenian people that later it was given the special classification of decadzane, and made punishable by death. Socrates, however, mentions none of this. He simply points out to Meno that Anytus is a good example of a man who has had an excellent father, who has ostensibly a wonderful education, who is acclaimed by others, and who has risen lately to such fame for his democratic spirit that he's become a leader among the Athenians. Let's ask this man, therefore, whether or not there are teachers of virtue among us, and if so, who they might be. Having been asked about who might be able to teach virtue or wisdom to the youth, Anytus scorns any suggestion that the sophists, those traveling foreign scholars and guns for hire, might be able to teach anyone anything of value. Anytus seems to have inherited this scathing view of the sophists from the traditional elites of the city, for he himself claims never to have spoken with a sophist man to man or in person. In his disdain for the sophists and their wise guy pretensions to knowledge, Anytus shares much in common not only with the great poets like Aristophanes, but also with the people, or demos, who were suspicious of such men and their effects on the traditions of education and knowledge, and of how these men in particular seem to offer power to people not at all associated with power traditionally, namely the aristocracy, but rather to the sons of men of lower birth, who could simply afford to pay their way into fame and power. Ironically, men like Anytus's father, as it turns out. Nope. Anytus, the man of the people, the rising democratic leader through and through, proclaims that virtue is something that any Athenian boy might learn from any Athenian gentleman. And what a wonderful bit of flattery this is, eh? What an excellent bit of a vote grab from the demos. Problem is, as we investigate all the scenarios brought forth of good Athenian fathers and good Athenian statesmen, we see how, although each father and statesman can find teachers to train his sons in horsemanship or battle or other sciences, disciplines, and arts, when it comes to passing on knowledge of how to rule, or how to be a good leader, or even how to just live an excellent life, well, things don't turn out so well. Socrates and Anytus cannot find a single example from all those they investigate of a father being able to find such a teacher. Rather than admit this curious fact, rather than wondering about the implications of this truth, Anytus can only see red. This truth is an affront to him. How dare Socrates imply, I don't know how to raise my kids? How dare Socrates imply that nobody in this town knows how to raise their kids to be good people, or just people, or good rulers? What nerve! What audacity! It is at this point that Anytus threatens Socrates, saying, You slander men lightly, Socrates. You better watch out what you say. You may be able to get away with this kind of crap in other cities, but here in Athens, we're wise to you. You're gonna get yours. And then Anytus leaves. Well, let me warn you too at this point, ladies and gentlemen, that if you decide to philosophize with your students in your classrooms, and if you decide to ask deep questions that perhaps undermine some of the pretensions to knowledge held by parents, if you do not meet their expectations as a teacher who will teach in the way that they imagine teaching ought to take place, well, don't be surprised if now and again they come after you too. If they gossip and chatter and talk about you at hockey games and if they misconstrue what you're doing. There are indeed forces afoot in schools to make you shut up, to make you toe the line, and fall into lockstep with the ordinary sorts of ways people expect that you should teach. Are you willing to engage in anitus? Is it foolish to engage in anitus? Should Socrates have run away? Should he have backed down? Should he have changed his attitude towards searching for wisdom when it could clearly bring down the wrath of the city upon his head? Should you change in your own deepest principles in order to keep your job? These may be questions you will have to ask at some point in your future career as a teacher. I put them to you here during our reading of the Meno because I think they're incredibly pertinent. Often folks who write about philosophy in the classroom or P4C or starting philosophy programs in schools or even just inquiry-based learning have a kind of wide-eyed naivety about how great it will be and about how everyone will just love it, about how happy folks will be once you bring it into your classroom. Let me stress to you here as plainly as I can that wherever true, genuine philosophic inquiry pops up among a democratic people, there is unrest, there is perplexity, and there will be folks who not only mock what you do, but may actively gun for what you are doing. To be like Socrates isn't just to ask questions and to wonder. You must cultivate courage in your daily teaching practices. There are antitheses in our midst, after all.